My subject is the media at the end of the 20th century. And I want to start with a short story. It's a story that was set in Russia in the 1950s when there was a spate of petty thieving going off in the factories. And in one particular factory, one of the guards called Ivan Ilirka, was actually placed as a special guard to watch the workers as they left every night. Now there was one particular worker, Petra, who was well known as something of a petty thief. And so Ivan watched him day after day as he went past the guard post on his way out of the factory. And each day he wheeled out in his wheelbarrow something pretty kind of unusual and suspicious looking. And Ivan said, "Look, come on, I know you well. Over to the side, unpack the wheelbarrow, we'll see what you're carrying out." And each day they went through this ritual of unpacking the wheelbarrow, and Petra simply said, "Oh, I'm carrying only shavings and bits of wood." And sure enough, each day it was shavings and bits of wood. And Ivan was getting very frustrated by the end of the first week because he knew jolly well that he wouldn't be going to all this trouble for shavings and bits of wood. So he had the shavings collected and had them analysed, he had the bits of wood searched, he had them sawn into smallest pieces, getting smaller and smaller. And at the end of 2 weeks, he was going beyond distraction. And he said to Petra, "Okay, look, I'll tell you, I'll drop all charges against you, all those things that you owe us for the last year, I'll drop the whole lot. Just tell me, what are you taking out beyond my nose that I can't detect?" "Wheelbarrows," said Ivan. Now that story is very important for us today because it shows us how we relate to our own culture. We can, as Christians, get terribly worried about minor details about life, as to whether we disagree on this issue or that issue. We can get terribly uptight about minor and small points of day-to-day functioning as Christians in our society. And we are very good at that, getting stewed up about peripheral things, when what we should be looking at slips by unnoticed. The big things, the big cultural shifts go past our noses without us even realizing it. And I think that's true in what's happened in the whole media revolution, and that's why I think it's important to give a lecture about the media at the end of the 20th century. So first of all, what are the media? And it's the plural of medium, which means means of communication. The media then are the intermediary between what's communicated and who receives the communication. And what is communication? And this is absolutely vital because communication comes from God. God is the great communicator, and there are three important areas in which God as communicator are central to us. First of all, God as giving communication. God communicates to us in the scriptures, the inscripturated word we call it. God communicates to us predominantly in Jesus, the incarnate word. God communicates to us in creation, the creation word, as Romans tell us. The creation has God's thumbprint on it. Everywhere we look, we see evidence that God is alive, that God is creator. So God communicates every day in all of these things, and especially through the scriptures and through the person of Jesus Christ. Secondly, God gives us the variety that we need today for our communication. The sheer richness of creation offers us an infinite variety and an infinite way of communicating. It's not just verbal. We communicate in art and in music and in symbol and in body and in touch. We communicate with facial expressions. We communicate in tone and dress and picture and color. And all of these things are provided for us by a bountiful God who has drenched the creation with them. And we also communicate verbally, in story and teaching and letters and prophecy and speech and so on. But communication is very big. It's not just one thing. And we're learning that as the decades go on. Thirdly, as well as God being communicator and God giving us the variety for communication, God also gives us the norms for communication. That means that communication is never neutral. Biblical norms are very important. They include honesty, not bearing false witness, not misrepresenting other people, building people up, calling people to reflect. The norms that God has put in are open, they're shared, they're trustworthy, they're created. Then norms of telling the truth, of faithfulness, expressions of servanthood, neighborliness, and aesthetic care. All of these are built in to the way in which we must communicate and are given to us by God. So, what are the media? What is communication? Next question, what is the mass media? What are the mass media? And the mass media roughly are communication for the masses. Not now interpersonal, but for people en masse. Before we can have mass media, we need the means of mass communication. You can see this very easily if you have the situation where you rely on a town crier. Only those people within earshot of his voice receive the communication. If you have newspapers, you've got a much wider audience. If you have sound waves and radio waves, you have a wider audience still. Television signals, satellites, digital communication, and so on. And suddenly, you're into something global. From the town crier into global communication. And that's where we are in terms of our own mass communication today. And the bigger the audience, the more sophisticated the technology, and the less varied, usually, the less varied the communication, except very recently with the internet and the web. That suddenly introduced a whole new variety into our complex communication network. I want to then talk about the growth of the mass media in Britain. And in Britain it's fascinating because the growth of the mass media is linked very much with national events. Newspapers are centuries old, and they've always been available to the literary, to the educated. And then as popular literacy grows, newspapers became more widely available. And in this century, newspapers were seen as the unifying feature of society. They told people what to think, what to believe. They propagated issues and concerns that were common to Britons as a whole. And especially around the war, the last war, they were there to convey information of national importance to a society which shared values, had shared values in common. And in the earlier days, the working classes were not patronized by newspapers. Papers, for example, like, and some of you might even remember this, the News Chronicle, were read widely by the politically aware and the intelligent worker, just as much as by the middle classes and the white-collar workers. And then the climate began to change. Papers went. The News Chronicle itself died, suffering from what one critic at the time called terminal thrombosis. He said it was a healthy circulation impeded by clots. Somebody got it wrong. Papers that to replace it then in the coming decades were far more downmarket, far more popularist, demanded far less from their readers. Old empires too, old newspaper magnate empires began to break up, the Beaverbrook Empire. And the new tycoons, Murdoch and co., didn't share and don't share the same notion of deference, the same notion of what is in the national interest, and the same idea of education, Britain's self-congratulation, and so on. And then the movement to tabloid newspapers were probably the final move. And with the tabloids, we now don't think of the newspapers as there to give information, which is what they always were, but to largely sensationalize, to titillate, to fabricate stories for media, for public entertainment, and of course, most of all, to sell copy. Newspapers are largely about selling copy, and the extent to which journalists will go in order to sell copy seems to be extreme. Film was there to entertain, not newspapers. Film was there as fantasy. It was the films in every city in the country that people rushed to in their thousands every Saturday night, and often on a weeknight too. And on serial days, Saturdays would be the serial days, so you'd have a film for the children in the morning and one for the older children in the afternoon, for the adults in the evening, and there'd be cliffhangers. They were the equivalent of our contemporary cinema, our contemporary television, but they were there as fantasy, as escape, and not the newspapers. newspapers were there to inform. When you look at the broadcasting media and their growth and change, they followed suit, although they stopped short of some of the trivializations of the worst tabloids. Radio and television were also seen, first of all, as unifying features of our society. They promoted social cohesion, even more than newspapers. Radio, in war and post-war, was a national pastime. It was very important to listen to the radio. And there were only 3 wavelengths with the BBC: the Home Service, the Light programme, and the Third programme. Wirelesses were very clumsy, often had these enormous batteries that had to be changed and taken back to the shops, usually by overworked housewives. And the population all through Britain listened to the same programmes. And the same programmes were related to the work that people did, to the roles they played in a very segregated, differentiated society. And the radio slotted into times for particular groups and upheld all kinds of stereotypes. So you had Housewife's Choice, Force's Favourites, Workers' Playtime, and so on. And each of these was slotted into a category when that group would be listening, and workers in a factory would take the lunchtime off to listen together to the radio. The very idea is extraordinary today, when not only has the radio gone from public use, but so has the lunchtime. And then we had to have Billy Cotton Band Show for the non-religious on a Sunday who wanted to flop around and read the newspapers. We'd have Journey into Space for small boys and their fathers and a few adventurous girls on a Tuesday night. And the radio then worked with agreed stereotypes that the whole country believed in, communicated British values on the world service to far-flung corners of empire and then Commonwealth, and it generally upheld the class, the race, the gender, the nationalism of the home country. When television came, it was the same. Very little difference in the early days of television. It was available at first only for the rich or for the very curious, and had only one channel for several decades. And in fact, it was a minority interest until one particular event changed all that. And the event, it was the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Now, I have acetates to show this, but I don't know how to do it because there's nobody around to help. So you'll have to imagine the acetate. So in terms of the television and radio and national coverage, in 1937, the coronation of George VI, the ceremony was broadcast on the radio, and during the communion, broadcasters cut away to sacred music. Paul, you're a sweetheart. By the time you come to 1953 and the coronation of Elizabeth II, there was a great controversy in the television medium. What was sacred? How far should television intrude? And eventually it was agreed that there should be a full showing of the ceremony, but there were fixed points for cameras. Cameras were not allowed to wander around and watch people picking their nose or people nudging each other or going to sleep in the service or anything like that. Fixed points for the cameras. And then there was a privacy of this anointing, this sacred moment when the Queen became Queen and was anointed by the Archbishop. But the coronation marked the first public access and enthusiasm for television. Not long after, in 1955, just over a third of all households in Britain had a television set. By 1960, this had risen to 80%. By 1976, it was 90%. The last count done in the early 90s said that virtually 98% of all households now had access to television, and it was far, far more common to have multiple sets. No longer the case that the whole family sits around one TV set and shares it in common. We've reached the age of hyper-individualism, where people do their own thing in their own bedrooms with their own sets. And that's, in a sense, developed the way in which the whole society has developed itself. We'll just quickly look at the advertising media. Thanks, I'll come back to you in a minute if I may. And the advertising media similarly have changed from being highly verbal, informative, to image-centered. The aim of advertising in its early days, and if you saw some of these advertisements, we laugh now, we laugh, because there are so many words. An advertisement for Pond's soap would take something like half a page of solid words describing the ingredients that went up to make the soap, what happened when you put it on your face, where you should use it with, and so on, and then the beauty that would result as an effect of using it. The idea was to give as much information about the product as possible, so that people could be persuaded to buy it by argument, by example, by masses and masses of details. And now, verbal content in most of our advertisements is nil. What you get is an image, and the focus is entirely on the image. Often the name of the product, and we were looking at some in our postmodern seminar just the other day, the name of the product doesn't even arrive until the very end. And then with no sales talk as such, nobody's trying to persuade you, nobody's arguing with words, nobody's mounting a case. In fact, the image and the product often are completely unrelated. And you wonder, how can that image sell that product? And the answer is because of the purpose of the advertisement is not to inform, it's to manipulate. It's to manipulate the image, to manipulate the experience of the viewer, to offer suggestion, association, but not to give information. Okay, those are some of the changes that we're seeing and that we have seen in the growth of the mass media. And now I want to ask, what's the movements behind the media? What's going on when we see some of these major changes in our society? And I've tried to show that the media don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of the shifts in culture as a whole. The cultural worldview that we now call modernity greatly influenced the beginnings of the media, especially the electronic and television and radio and broadcasting media in their early days. The model was one of efficient economic rationality, built on a rational individual model, which then had to use mass production as a key of efficiency. And if you know anything about Fordism in car, Fordism is now the name for this efficient, mass-productive mentality. Standardization, centralization, which rationally ensured maximum efficiency. And that was the idea behind the broadcasting and television media too. Along with that went a notion of the common good. And the common good was defined by the expert, by the rational mind, sometimes by the politicians, by statespeople, by those in authority. And the expert was always right. The expert was the final point of reference, whether it was the doctor doing the diagnosis, or the scientist telling you about how science works, or the politician explaining to you what was in the national good and so on. We were a deferential country, and people who were the experts took control. And what we had was now called paternalism. The media were part of the paternalist culture. They told us what we wanted to know, as defined by them. And so the next point is that paternalism was key in understanding what went on in television and radio. The media people saw themselves as public servants. They were there to present what they thought the public needed to know and to carefully shield the public from what the public did not need to know. The public, by and large, did not need to know about the sexual exploits of the then Prince of Wales, so we didn't know about them. Why would the public be interested in what Edward, Prince of Wales, got up to in his private life? And in fact, it would be really harmful for the public to know, because if they knew, they might have disrespect for the monarchy. They might actually begin to see that there were cracks in the situation of the national consensus as a whole. And so they didn't want to disrupt social cohesion or moral consensus. They rather wanted to promote it. And it wasn't that we needed censorship. The media were their own censors. There weren't all of these little groups telling Lord Beaverbrook, you must not publish that. He made the decisions. Whatever was not in the national interest, whatever scoured the royal family, whatever brought disrepute into the country as a whole, the public did not need to know about it. We will keep silent on these issues. Now, you can't imagine, well, I don't have to tell you, how different that is from today. And the whole idea today of the public not knowing or not needing to know or not having a right to know has completely disappeared. And instead, it's that very knowledge of the sensational, the immoral, the ridiculous, the evil, the promiscuous, and even most the exploits of people in high places, it's the very wrongdoings of those people that sells the most newspapers, that makes the most interesting television. And there's a contest for airspace and for sound bites from those people who are wanting to promote one side or another. So the paternalism of the old media consensus and the functionalism of the media. The functionalism meant that we had to uphold a functionalist view of society, that every social institution in Britain had one task and one task only, and that task was to maintain social cohesion. So whether you were in the family, or the church, or the media, or in business, or in production, or whatever, you had one task: to maintain social cohesion. And therefore, the whole idea of what was dysfunctional was frowned upon. And the family was not seen as a relationship of people who were there to bring up children and nurture them in love, so much as a group of people who had a certain function to play for society as a whole. Everything was subordinate to the centrality of society. Society, spelt with a capital S, was, if you like, almost the god. And there's still a functionalist element in public broadcasting today, as mass and blanket coverage is given to what are deemed to be key public events, royal weddings, VE Day celebrations. We tried our best during VE Day to make that a massive, massive thing, but it really was a bit of a whimper. Why? Because that's not where Britain is right now. We're not with these big national public consensus things. We're a fragmented society with little bits, and we're not interested in being manipulated by big stories, meta-narratives anymore. But still we go on with the media, and the media in many ways, certainly the television media, are almost behind the times in this. The Falklands Law, the Gulf War, and so on. And most countries expect the media to focus on their own participation, their own results in competitive sporting events. We watch the Olympic Games and the World Cup from one view only, and that's from the view of how well are we doing in the medals or the charts. For as long as technology remained within the centralized control of the experts and the regulatory bodies with the agreement of the population, social cohesion was maintained. But things were changing fast. And what changed, I think, to some extent, took everybody's breath away. And I want to look at it in two ways, first of all. I want to see what change took place in people's minds as they watched television programs and they watched the media. There was a much more dramatic change that we'd ever thought about. What tended to happen is that reality and fantasy got all mixed up. We were moving from one tradition to another, and we didn't know how to handle it. It's like that story that you often get in Judaism, the story about the Orthodox and the Jewish contest. And there is an Orthodox man whose son is about to come up for his bar mitzvah. And he says to his son, "You were a good boy, very good boy. Now I would like to give you a present for your bar mitzvah, whatever you want, anything you want. You're a good boy, and I would like to help you. And what would you like for your bar mitzvah?" And the son thinks about it, and he says, "I'd like a Pentium processor, Dad." "Fine, fine, my son, you shall have a Pentium processor," says Dad. Gets on the phone to his brother. "Brother, your nephew, my son, he's a good boy, and he's coming up to his bar mitzvah, as you know. And I said we will give him a present, and he's asked for a Pentium processor." "What's a Pentium processor?" And Uncle says, "Oh, these youngsters, they're so religious. I don't know what a Pentium processor is. We'll go and see the rabbi. We'll go to the Orthodox rabbi. He knows these things." So they trot along to the Orthodox rabbi, and he says, "Elaine, oh, Abraham, good to see you. Come in, everything is ready for bar mitzvah. There's no worry, my friends, if you're worried." And they say, no, we're worried. But it's Ephraim's son. He's a good boy. He's been a good boy. And we want to give him a present for his bar mitzvah. And he's asked for a Pentium processor." "What's a Pentium processor?" And the Orthodox rabbi says, "Oh, I don't know. I'm so out of touch with these traditions, these new ideas." "We know what we do. We go and see the Reform rabbi. Reform rabbis know all about these things, curse them." So they toddle off to the Reform rabbi, and the Reform rabbi comes to the door and he says, Moshe, I haven't seen you in an age, Moshe. What do I do to have this wonderful opportunity for a visit? And Moshe replies, well, it's Ephraim here, and he has a son coming up for bar mitzvah, and he's a good boy, a really good boy, and they want to give him a present for his bar mitzvah, and he's asked for a Pentium processor for his bar mitzvah. What's a Pentium processor? And the Reform rabbi says, it's a computer. What's a bar mitzvah? We can find out that tradition takes us unawares and things have moved on without our recognizing it. And that's precisely what happened in the whole area of the media. Things dramatically changed, both for the watching public, but also in terms of the technology itself. To start with, reality and fantasy then got all mixed up, partly through the invasion of film into our screens, when film has always been about fantasy, film has always been expected to be about fantasy, but now it became the daily diet of people in their own homes. And so they could switch into fantasy for an hour a day, 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day. And the daily diet of soap operas, I believe, has changed the minds of our public. Far more than our preaching is able to. Because they're seeing characters that they know and they recognize. They relate to these characters vicariously. They live slices of their lives. They think about them. They try to work out their problems for them. And it's very clever because the media soaps are all designed that way. Each character has a stereotype. It fills a role. And so in any soap opera, you have the same kind of groups. You have the moralist, you have the baddie, the carefree person who doesn't have a hang in the world, you have the sporty one, the precocious one, the ambitious one, the kind one, the sexy one, the agony aunt, and so on. And they are all slotted into every conceivable soap opera you get. The one who is always trying to lure the good away from the straight and narrow, and so on. And people began to live vicarious lives, finding relationships on the television screen so much less demanding than relationships in the home. Much easier. The television screen doesn't get angry with you when you fail to remember a birthday or didn't send a birthday card. Doesn't nag at you when you haven't washed socks. Doesn't complain if you don't do your share of the washing up. And so characters on a television screen become a substitute for many people in the population for the real relationships they should be having within their own families, within their own neighborhoods, within their own friendship circles. And we turn into a lonely population, unable to relate because we don't spend time with one another. We spend time with the television, with the characters who ask nothing of us but give us everything that we need for working out our day-to-day existences. People on average, I'm told, watch 20 hours of television a week. Some watch as many as 30 hours of television a week. It easily outclasses school and education in the lives of youngsters. If you worked out 24 hours a week, that's 10 solid years of watching television for someone aged 70. By the time these people are 70, they will have watched 10 years, day and night, of television. Extraordinary. And what impact does it have on our minds is extraordinary, it's enormous. Outdoes almost every other form of communication, every other kind of set of relationships. And what people are watching is more and more the kind of stuff that is undemanding, that does just offer these unreal characters where fantasy and reality get mixed up. But there's enough of reality to get people hooked. There's enough of reality in EastEnders. There's enough of reality in Coronation Street, in Neighbours, in Home and Away, and so on, to actually draw people in and keep them hooked for years and years on end. And so what's also key there is how these characters then mediate to us the reality that we know. And there's a lot of talk at the moment about the EastEnders soap and the way that it is mediating Christianity to the millions of people who watch it every week. Millions and millions are learning about Jesus Christ are learning about the gospel not from our preaching in the churches, not from our writing, not from our loving or our neighborhood groups, but from East Enders. And what are they learning? They're learning that Christians are hypocrites, that actually the clergy are no better than anybody else, and that if you want a real life, if you want real understanding, real wisdom, you're better off with your pagan friends than getting mixed up with this religious lot who will do nothing for you except twist you up, distort your emotions, and leave you high and dry. It's not surprising if after decades of watching stuff like that, or even weeks of watching stuff like that, people's level of resistance to the gospel is higher and higher. And so it's the relationship between fantasy and reality. It's the way in which the newspapers then themselves take up this dilemma. What are most of the tabloid newspapers writing about? They're writing about characters on television, where the people and the characters they play become fused. Which is the reality? Is it the person playing the character in EastEnders, or is it the EastEnders character? And we become obsessed by the private life of those people who play characters with which we have begun to engage in our day-to-day existence. And the newspapers follow them around, they give them copy, they give them hype, and suddenly the whole society is turned into a soap opera. And so the soap opera doesn't stop with what we're seeing on the screen, it also extends to the lives of politicians, to the lives of the clergy, and of course, most of all, to the royal family. And so the royal family itself becomes a new soap opera, where the bid for viewing on television, for television coverage, for being able to manipulate audiences, for putting your case better than the other person, becomes woven into what we see as part of our daily diet. What I haven't touched on yet, and I want to do this before I close and ask for questions, is the impact of postmodernity. And postmodernity, which we've been doing in our other seminars here, and they're still doing it today, and I should be back there in a few minutes answering some questions, I hope, changes the whole nature of what we understand to be both society, but also the impact that media has on society. Postmodernity is disenchanted with the one big story that the media offered us in these old days of social cohesion and national consensus. And there's a great skepticism about the achievements of what they call instrumental rationality, the ambiguity of humanist reform, the debunking of objectivity into local interests, petty interests. Okay, you think that the scientists are fantastic, but look at this, and out comes some petty idea. The deconstructing of key terms of the humanist debate: truth, justice, rational, human. Justice? What's justice, they say? Justice is just very rich men being able to buy very persuasive solicitors to get them off crimes we all knew they committed. Is that justice? And so the debunking of meta-narratives of the Enlightenment and of modernity lead to a cynicism in the culture as a whole, which is there represented on the media at the end of the 20th century. That, accelerated by a massive speeding up in the technological revolution, has been probably the biggest change in our culture this century. And there's a big question as who now guides the culture? And who now guides the media? Does the media guide the technology, or does the technology direct the media? And we can't say anymore, because the rapid change, the decentralization, the fragmentation of the media, the multi-channels, the sheer variety is there partly because of the changing technology, but partly because this is what postmodernity is like. So let me just run through 10 key features of the postmodern mind that affects the media. 1, there is no knowledge outside specific forms of discourse. Reality is only simulation. It's only what we take it to be at any given time in any given place. And so eventually there becomes a total blurring of public reality and image. And we've watched this for so many years that we now expect it. What is real? What we see. What is real about the Prince of Wales? What we see on television. What is real about the Princess of Wales? What we see. So the contest is on what we see, and to be presented there as evident and visible. The second big point is that the only place we can stand is within a representation. The struggle for objectivity or neutrality is over. There is no possibility in postmodern mind of any kind of neutrality. The attempted objectivity of the observer is replaced by the immersion of the spectator. And where we are in much postmodern visual media is we are experiencing things in totality. We are immersed in experience, in visual experience, in sound experience. If you don't believe me, go to any young people's big gig and have the experience. And what they come away with is a sense of experience, of being together in an experience which doesn't have any names, doesn't have any description, doesn't even have words that you can apply to it. It's just the totality of experience. Bodily sensation is just as much important in communication as verbal sensation, and probably more so. Probably more so. This is far more sophisticated than saying feelings matter more than words. It's to do with the totality of our experience. The next point is that the word, and we know this so well, the word is replaced by the image, and that's fine, except the image is shifting, ambiguous. We can't tie it down. The image offers us endless possibilities for creation, for recreation, for movement, for removement. The image is also rootless, has no history to it. History's been chopped off. So you can put images next to each other in amazing rapidity and create a completely new image, and that's fine too. I spoke in the postmodern seminar of a video I saw of religion for young people. And it started with the Jews at the Wailing Wall nodding and bowing before the Wailing Wall, followed by Hindu women gathering around a funeral pyre where the smoke was rising, followed by Islamic women heavily veiled walking through a town, followed by a Christian cross, a great big ornate cathedral cross that slammed in the middle of the screen. And the music continued, and the images reversed and moved around, and bit by bit they changed. You found it was the Islamic women at the Wailing Wall, and the Hindu women who were actually standing around the cross. And eventually the cross changed from being a silver cross to a wooden cross, to a cross with the sacred cow of Hinduism on it, to a cross where the bleeding of the Hindu cow had entrails leading down the wood, and so on. With juxtaposition of these images, all confusing, no history to any of them, no meaning to any of them. And what were they saying at the end? They were saying, have a religious experience. That's what it's about. A religious experience that is rootless, no history, and has no future to it. Now, there are very important ways that we have to connect with that rather than simply passing judgment. I'm not wanting to pass judgment on these areas. I'm wanting us to understand. The fourth point then is that the past and the future are ephemeral. History is just one damn thing after another, and it's finished. The future, we don't know about. It might never come. So what's important is that we live for today. And postmodernity has turned pilgrims into tourists. We are not pilgrims. We're not on a journey anywhere. We haven't been anywhere. We haven't come from anywhere. We are merely tourists. And tourists are particularist, voyeurist, experiential. We are here to get the experience. And history itself is turned into a massive theme park where we go and get the experience. And postmodernity then destabilizes the whole process of representation. It offers us a playful mixture of styles, and this is what's so exciting about the image and the media in a postmodern context. Parody, pastiche, that means putting together things that don't belong together, like the video I just said. Irony, changing things into a joke, a laugh, playfulness, and all of these serve to distance the viewer from what they're seeing, from the representation. And then a multiplicity of designs and genres visual references, styles, historic references, decoration, typography. If you go to a big cathedral in Nazareth, you'll see an incredible postmodern cathedral where all sorts of things are mixed up together to say what? To say we can do this with images. And so you have this massive Barbie doll next to the Virgin Mary, an icon, a traditional icon. And you can do that if you want to. And you have columns that don't hold anything up. The building isn't held up, but you have columns in the cathedral, so here, have a column. But the column is at such an angle it couldn't possibly hold the ceiling up. And you have windows in the cathedral, so here, have a window. Except there's no real window there, it's a pretend window, painted on the wall. And the playfulness of postmodernity, architecture and art and the visual media is there even more powerfully in the electronic media as you play with the image, you play with the sensation, and it's always a restless image, no fixed resting point. It's never going anywhere, it's never come from anywhere, it's always on the move. Destabilization then of our visual medium. And then the sixth point, fragmentation, which means that there's an ever wider dispersal and dissemination of artistic procedures all working together, plundering history, taking things out of history and serving them up for the now in a plurality and a relativism. Seventh, the media don't inform, they now denote existence. What I mean by that is, if you don't see something on television, it's not real. How do you know if something exists? You see it on television. How do you know if something's important? You see it on television. If you don't see it on television, then how do we know that it exists at all? And this is very interesting, and of course all the politicians know this in this current general election. That's why there's such a huge demand for access to television. That's why the referendum party is going to field all these candidates. Because if it fields candidates, it will have access to television, and then people will know that it exists. They don't want to put arguments on television. They don't want to persuade us by television. They just want to be there, to be imaged. My husband's standing in the next election. He's standing as a Christian Democrat. He won't have a lot of television coverage. There's only him. And so effectively, from a media point of view, he doesn't exist. And having to fight a campaign where you don't exist from a media point of view, and yet where you have policies and you believe positions and Christian statements that you think are vital to our country, is a very lonely place to be in. And that's the place we're often in as Christians, doing what we do over and over again. 3 more quick points. There's been a breakdown between public and private space. The most intimate details of people's lives are now part of the public space. They're able to be represented. We want them to be represented. We want to see all the gory details. We don't want to miss a trick. And the contest for television space by those who want to come and confess the details of their private life. What do we want to hear about the Prince of Wales? We want to know whether he committed adultery or not. We want to hear it for ourselves. We want to see the confession for ourselves. And so conveniently he comes on and tells the whole country. And the breakdown between public and private, which is a harmful division in many ways. And it's good that the division breaks down, because that's the way we get rid of hypocrisy. But the problem is that there is no longer any suggestion that what the private entails has moral implications. And then the whole question of social cohesion, as I've suggested, is fragmented and localized. And the final point, that in the middle of all this fragmentation, in the middle of all this new technology, the focus on the image, the speed, the sensation, the experience, the constant flux, there is one meta-narrative, one absolute, if you like, that still remains. And I wonder if you can guess what it is. I'll tell you, because I can't see it because the lights are there. It's the citizen as consumer. It's consumerism. And consumerism is, in the end of the day, the great central meta-narrative. I shop, therefore I am, says Graham Cray. And families that shop together, stop together. And much of the control, therefore, has gone to the media as consumption. We consume the media. We consume through the media. And that's why people like Rupert Murdoch are so powerful, because they have at their disposal all this consumption power that they can exercise, for good or for bad, a global personal empire where he can actually change the whole dynamics of a little town in Yorkshire, which has a small rugby league team, which plays a little town in Lancashire with a small rugby league team. And that's gone on for 100 years, and they play together, and they have friendly competitions. And Rupert Murdoch says, I don't like this rugby league little thing. We can make a much bigger thing out of this. We can make a global empire out of this. We can make a super league. We can actually have it televised all through the world. I can make a large amount of money. So how if I put a lot of money into rugby league, but I don't want you to have your little team anymore? I want you to scrap your team, and I want my team that I will pick from all of you. And I will do that because I can, because I've got the money and you need the money. And if I don't give you the money, your teams will crumble anyway. They'll just become fifth rate. But if I do give you the money, I get the people I want. I get my sports empire. I can put it on Sky Television throughout the world. And bit by bit, small communities have to capitulate to the big media tycoons who can come in on any level at any point and say, this is what I want. This is why I want it. This is the way I want to run things. The power of the media and those who control the media is absolutely colossal, absolutely enormous, far, far beyond the issues that Christians are usually bothered about, which is censorship. Okay, I'm running out of time. I've got to get back to my other seminar. But I want to just ask in closing and let you come back to me, how do we respond as Christians? What should we be doing about this in our own day and age, the media at the end of the 20th century? First things are very practical, internal ways of responding. We must monitor and carefully help our children's viewing patterns with regard to television. Not to censor, but to actually be with them when they're seeing things that might be disturbing or harmful. Watching television with our children, steering them through it, asking questions, getting them to ask questions, getting them to watch critically is something that's very important, rather than using the television as a babysitter. Television is not a very good babysitter. It gives them the wrong value system. Secondly, write to those who are in charge of programs, radio, television, broadcasting media. It's vital. They need to hear from you. They do. I'm on a panel, a team that monitors the output of ITV, Channel 4 and BBC, and we are obliged to listen to visitors and listeners and viewers' letters. Write, most of all with positive suggestions. If something you saw was good, let them know it. If a Christian made a point that was absolutely vital, let them know it. Write intelligently, never discussed at Tunbridge Wells. Those papers usually find their way into the wastepaper basket. So write and keep on writing, because in this postmodern age, it's the viewer's individual fragmented response that actually matters. You are consumers. The third thing is to actually encourage those Christians at the cutting edge of the media with all the energy you can. Encourage them. Encourage those who are on the media, those who are involved in presentation, in argument or whatever, but also the program makers. Encourage those Christians who are forming their own companies, trying to get into what is a very hostile environment. Encourage and pray for those Christians who are at the edge of the new technologies, who are developing new ways of communicating to young people, whose whole experiences of the image, of the incessant, restless, noisy image, and know the creativity far more than we do. Pray for those, encourage them, give them space and time as Christians to know how to respond to these areas. Find out who are the artists, who are the playwrights, who are the dramatists, who are the performers who can perform in a postmodern age with the media. Pray for them, promote them, get your church to sponsor them. We need them desperately. And most of all, withhold criticism and judgment from those Christians in the media who are not coming up to your expectations. There are reasons for that you may know nothing about. Pray for them instead. Encourage them. Yearn for them, that God will do mighty things through them. And then just see how we can all influence the changing technologies, get involved in the internet, get involved in the web. Pray for the Christian students in science who are using the internet in a very imaginative, very enriching way. All the possibilities that come from the electronic media are ours as well as the dangers. So the media at the end of the 20th century is powerful organizations, powerful tools. They have our society in their hands. But we are Christians with the gospel, which is yet more powerful. And we can call the media to account, and we can infiltrate the media, and we can work there as Christians, and we can help another generation with different ways, different technologies, different energies, different mindsets to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ into the 21st century. I finished. There are about 10 minutes for questions, and I'd be delighted to take them. And somebody's going to run around with the microphone, and if you could shout them out, it'd be marvelous.
In your talk, you've given us a lot of sort of analysis about the media. How would you like it to develop? What's your sort of vision for it?
How would I like what developed?
What's your sort of vision for the media? Do you think it should go back to how it was, or do you have a different vision for it?
What vision do I have for the media?
Yes.
I mean, we are in a pluralist age, and we will always have a pluralist media. And so I think my own vision is different for the television media, for the broadcasting media, for the newspaper media, and so on. But I think most of all, my main vision is that there should be space for Christians to contend in the marketplace, to actually present the Christian gospel within the media in whatever creative and imaginative way we can do. But that doesn't necessarily just mean preaching in the media. It means developing art forms where we talk about redemption and the meaning of redemption as it filters through society. What is redemption in family life? What is redemption in relationships? What is redemption in the arts? There's lots of opportunity to do that. And I would like to see those kinds of themes coming out of our drama and our film, rather than the themes of pessimism and nihilism and emptiness. There are real possibilities of affecting the media in that way, and I think that we've got the Christians who can do it. So that's one of my many visions. Another point?
Yes, you mentioned about Christians getting involved in the media. Well, that may be in the future. At present, I would put it to you that self-regulation is no solution at all, bearing in mind campaigns by people like David Alton over video violence, even about bringing up subjects like incest, homosexuality and whatever on the soap operas. Would it be fair to say that we would take the point that self-regulation is no solution at present?
Yes, self-regulation doesn't actually exist. I mean, there are contractual obligations of the BBC, and there is a charter which is monitored. So to a certain extent the self-regulation is there because the charter's there, and it's heavily monitored, I have to tell you that. But because it relies so much on the public and public acceptance of what it sees, Christians are always going to be in a minority. You have to make your voice heard. So if you look at the BBC Charter, it says very clearly we must not offend public taste and decency. We may not misrepresent Christian belief. And whenever we meet as a committee, I take the producers to that. Look, this is a promise that the BBC has made. Now that these viewers say that you are violating that promise. So that is very important, and those kinds of issues continue. But I think it is for the public to be more active in this area rather than just shrugging one's shoulder and say there's nothing we can do about it, it's all going to the dogs. It might feel like that, but there are many Christians in the BBC who themselves would like to change things. I think we've capitulated because we have not channeled Christians into the media. Other groups have, and we're seeing the result of that. But we have actually discouraged them very often. We said, look, this is worldly stuff. You know, you better go off and be a nurse. Doesn't help. I mean, nursing is wonderful. I'm not discouraging nurses. But I'm saying we do need people at the cutting edge. And I think that the more we actually have that, the easier it will be. More questions?
Were you alluding to the fact that Were you alluding to the fact that on some of the discussion programs where we feel Christians have not kept their end up or spoken sensibly, that we're actually seeing a heavily edited version, and that someone has got an agenda that the real gospel or a really striking point does not really get through, just a few vagaries that they can put up with?
Mm-hmm. Yes, everything, when you see programs edited before and after, programs are being edited by program makers, some of whom have got particular points to raise and particular points to get across. I must be phoned every week by some program maker who says, could I quote you as saying this, this, and this? Would you come on there and say this and this? And I say, no, that's not my position at all. My position is this, this, and this. And rather than listening to what I'm saying, they then say, oh, well, could you give us the telephone numbers of 4 people who would say this, this, and this? So they've already decided what program they want to say, what views they want to hear, what positions they want. They're not actually interested in any difference. And those program makers, are a real problem, because they're going to make that program whether I say this and this or somebody else does. And it's already fixed from day one. Now, I think those are bad programs, but there are a lot of other program makers who are not like that, who are genuinely interested in looking at the issues from a deeper perspective. And there are many Christian producers in that sense. But the edited version of anything which is being cut and hacked about could be very, very different from what you see. I mean, most films are that, most documentaries, you have an interview which lasts 10 minutes, and they will use maybe a minute of that, and they will cut it up into small segments and feed it in what they like. And so they can distort what you're saying or make you say whatever they want you to say. That is dangerous. I will only work on documentaries with program makers I respect, and otherwise go out live. It's much, much safer, except when you make a mess of it.
What would you say? Sorry, what would you say about the proliferation of television channels and what that means for whether we need specifically Christian channels? I mean, is it going to get to the point where people just choose what they watch, and they're only going to watch or find Christian stuff if they choose a channel?
Yes, proliferation of channels it breaks down this whole social cohesion and national consensus again, and it says the whole point about postmodernity is variety and consumer choice. You can choose whatever you want, and here, if you haven't got enough choice with 4, let's have 10, 20, 50, 500, and so on. So it's endless. Of course, there'll have to be Christian channels amongst those, but if you look at the Christian channels in the States, they're fairly awful, most of them, and really pretty dire. I mean, I've seen some of the worst possible television in the world on Christian channels. I remember at the end of the Falklands War, when the soldiers were coming back, you had this man saying, now I have last seen the gospel return to North America, a young man in a uniform saying, and great tears trickling down his face, I love my country. And then you had these pictures of these soldiers marching back, and underneath it said, we fight not against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers. And then you had excess missiles going off and saying, we fight with the armor of righteousness and so on. I mean, I couldn't watch the stuff. It was absolutely blasphemous. And that's going out on the Christian media in the name of God. So having a Christian title for a program doesn't mean that you're going to get Christian content. It means that you might get a certain kind of nationalism dressed up as Christianity. But I think that good Christian media, best of all, it's there on the channels that people are not expecting it. And if we can intersperse it with, within the BBC as it presently exists, it's got to be a good thing. But yes, good Christian channels, they've got to do a great service. In Holland, it's breaking down now. You had the system where the media was paid for by subscription. So you subscribed to Christian channels. It was your part of your tithing, really. And each company had airtime dependent upon the size of the subscriptions. And you had a very great variety, a pluralism, but a pluralism that each had roots and each had a worldview behind that particular program or particular channel. And some good programs came out of it, but they were never of the technological excellence that the BBC does. But I think that the Christian voice has to be there, wherever we put it. I don't want to squabble as to whether we should have it on Christian channels or non-Christian channels, BBC, ITC. Let's just get it there and get it out and start moving with it. I think there's probably time for no more. Well, one more if there is somebody who's anxious to speak.
Hello. My question is about music media, really.
Didn't that catch that already?
The question's about music media. There are a lot of young Christian people who are forming rock bands, and trying to influence the secular music field. Could you give advice to people doing this?
I'm not very good at advising youngsters on their rock medium, partly because I think the whole thing is awful anyway. I mean, you know, I went into to a really big gig which my son dragged me along to, and I stepped inside and it was heavy metal, very, very dark, flashing lights going in all directions, images all over the place, and I thought, well, hell must be something like this, you know. It really felt like that. So I'm not the person to ask for advice. The person really to ask is my 19-year-old son, who is busy writing music, Christian music, which will actually engage with his culture. And he is doing it with prayer, with sensitivity, with care, very anxious to, if the videos are made with it, that he doesn't abuse the image or abuse the listener, but that he actually has faithful biblical communication through it. What it sounds like wouldn't necessarily impress people of a different generation who are used to hymns ancient and modern or the Moody and Sankey hymn book. It's different. But for his generation, they sit up and take notice. They listen. They say, this is different. And then he can explain the gospel in the context of that. So I think we have to listen more. And I go along with what Steve Chalk said yesterday. Listen to the younger people more. Take advice from them. Hear them, trust them. Because they're the harbingers of that generation. And we are crumblies. Or wrinklies in my case. I think it's time for us to go. Thank you for being here. You've been great.